Hey guys, Mr. Champlin here. Today we're going to be talking about the phylum Annelida and their major characteristics. So the phylum Annelida, these are the segmented worms, and the name actually comes from the Latin word for ring. So if you think about an earthworm, it's made up of a lot of rings or segments. Okay, so what are the characteristics of the annelids? Well, firstly, they have a coelom. So remember, the coelom is this fluid-filled opening. Oh, that's not the right word. I meant to say a fluid-filled space, and in that space is where you're going to find the major organs. Now, this is the first group of animals that has a true coelom. We said that the flatworms had no coelom, and we said the roundworms had a pseudocoelom or a fake coelom. Now, again, earthworms and their relatives do not have a skeleton. They don't have any bones, but they have what's called a hydrostatic skeleton, which is just to say that the water or the fluid inside their bodies, pushes out and it kind of helps to give them some support and some shape. What else do the annelids have? Well, they have much more specialized body systems than we've seen so far. So we're going to see that their circulatory system, their digestive system, and their nervous system is more sophisticated than what we've seen thus far. And again, we are coming back to this idea of segmentation. So this particular group is the first group to have segmentation. And we're going to see this in many groups of animals later on where this idea of segmentation keeps coming back again and again. So this also means that organs are paired in segments. So think of like with humans, we have 2 kidneys, we have 2 lungs, and that sort of thing. So it's just this whole idea of this, these rings or segments that contain many of the same organs. So again, the coelom is this fluid-filled body cavity that comes from the mesoderm, and it contains the major organs. So if you take somebody and you slice them like this, right, that would be the coelom right here. Now you've seen this, of course, in the movies when somebody dies and they're trying to figure out why they died, and they kind of cut them open and they look inside. They have this big body cavity that contains the heart and the lungs and all that stuff. So that is the coelom. Now again, segmentation. So we're going to see in these worms that they have lots of segments. You can see here in this worm here, it's got lots of little segments, and they're pretty similar. We also will see it with the arthropods. They also have segments, but you see that the segments on one end are different than the segments on the other end. And of course, humans have some segmentation too. And if you look at Mr. Champlin's abs, for example, you would notice that this idea of segmentation, comes back again. The larval stage of the annelids and the larval stage of the mollusks look very, very similar. All right, so it has this thing called a trochophore larva. Now this larval stage is actually microscopic, but you'll notice that it has this kind of sort of spaceship shape to it with some cilia on each end and some cilia here in the middle. All right, so because both the annelids and the mollusks have this larva stage that looks very, very similar, they think that they are related, that they, evolved from a similar ancestor. Doing great here. Okay. Some other annelid biosystems that we got to mention would be the nervous system. So the nervous system, a little bit more sophisticated than we've seen so far. So they have what's called a cerebral ganglia. Again, not necessarily a brain, but definitely in the front of the worm, we have this ganglia or collection of nerve cells that is getting bigger and more complex. So again, it's not quite a brain, but it's certainly getting there. They also have 2 different nerve cords. They have one that runs down either side of the ventral surface here. Some of the annelids have pretty good eyes. Some can just sense light and darkness. They certainly have all kinds of sense organs that are good at sensing touch and for smell or chemical receptors. So of course you had experience, if you touch an earthworm, it will move away from you, right? Or if you put an earthworm down on the ground, it will immediately burrow into the soil because it can tell the difference between up and down and light and dark. And so again, their nervous system is a little bit more sophisticated than the nematodes that we've already seen. As far as respiration goes, how do they breathe? Well, as we've seen so far, many of these guys exchange gases right through their skin. So in that sense, things have not changed all that much. But there are some of these annelids that live in the ocean, especially, that have gills. And so if you look down here, this is an annelid, and what it does is it kind of burrows in the sand, and it sort of lets out these feathery structures, which are actually gills. Now it uses these gills for both respiration or breathing, and also for capturing fine particles of food, or filter feeding out of the water. Another thing we should mention with respiration is that the skin where the respiration takes place has to be moist, and oftentimes it contains mucus to help it stay moist. And we all know what happens to an earthworm when it dries out. What happens? Well, it dies. Why does it die? Because it simply cannot transfer oxygen and CO2 through that surface. Some other body systems that we should mention is support and movement. So again, they don't have a skeleton, but they do have muscles, right? And unlike the roundworms, which only have longitudinal muscles, these guys have both circular and longitudinal muscles. And so what do we mean by that? So the longitudinal muscles would go lengthwise this way, and the circular muscles, as the name suggests, kind of go around. So the animal itself can actually get fatter and skinnier using these circular muscles, and can get longer or shorter using these longitudinal muscles. And again, I'm sure you've seen this when you've seen earthworms moving around. These annelids, many of them, but not all, but many of them also have these things that are called setae. And what are the setae? These are hair, bristle-like structures that are on the segments that kind of stick out from the sides. And this actually helps them to move. It helps them to get a grip as they move through water or soil or whatever they're moving through. As far as the digestive system goes, they have, again, as we already mentioned, they have a complete digestive tract, a mouth, and an anus, so nothing new there. But they do have more and more complex organs for processing food. So we're going to see with the earthworm that the digestive system is very, very complex. It's really the most complex system they have, and they have all kinds of different organs that they use for eating food and digesting it. And of course, what do earthworms eat? They eat soil. So as we do the earthworm dissection, of course, you'll become better acquainted with all of these organs that make up their digestive system. As far as the circulatory system goes, they actually have two blood vessels. They have a blood vessel that is found on the dorsal surface, or the back surface, and they also have a major blood vessel that's found on the ventral or the stomach surface. And what happens with these guys is that the blood that goes in the ventral blood vessel goes towards the posterior or the anus end, and the dorsal blood vessel goes the opposite direction. It goes towards the anterior or towards the head end. So you can see you get this nice, circulation of blood in the worm. Also, many of these worms have what are called, they have these sort of thickened blood vessels, and we'll see this in the earthworm. And these actually will pump blood, so they kind of act like little hearts. They're not technically hearts, but they act like hearts. Also, the blood vessels that run on the dorsal surface and the ventral or the stomach surface also can contract and help to pump blood. So this is huge because the worms have what's called a closed circulatory system, which means they have blood found in blood vessels. Doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal, but remember, this is the first time we've seen this. So these are the first animals that we've seen thus far that actually have blood and actually have blood vessels that carry the blood. So we, of course, have a heart and blood vessels and blood, so that's not that big a deal. But again, this is the first group that actually has blood and blood vessels. So much more sophisticated, and as you can see, it's going to help them to move oxygen and CO2 and digested food throughout the body. And they don't have to just rely on diffusion, which can be a very, very slow process. Excretory system, how do they get rid of waste? Now remember, we're not talking about poop here, we're talking about pee, right? So we're talking about nitrogenous waste. So what is nitrogenous waste? Nitrogenous waste is the waste product that occurs when nucleic acids and proteins are broken down. So how does this work? Well, again, this is the first time we've seen an actual organ that is used to clean out the blood and to excrete or get rid of this nitrogenous waste. So the annelids have what's called a nephridia. And you can think of the nephridia as like a sort of pre-kidney. It's sort of just the beginnings of a kidney. And in fact, your kidney is made up of many, many structures that look very similar to these nephridia. So what do? Well, what they do is the nephridia is this sort of um, blue structure here, and you can see it's got lots of blood vessels that surround it. And so what happens is the waste products move out of the blood from these blood vessels into this blue tube of the nephridia, and then it's excreted out of the body through pores in the skin. So again, sort of kind of similar to our sweat glands in some ways, um, and sort of similar to our kidneys in other ways. So again, this is the first time we're seeing this sort of specialized organ that's just for excretion or getting rid of this nitrogenous waste. Reproduction. So how do these guys reproduce? Well, as we've seen in many of these simple animals, many of them can reproduce asexually. That is to say, if you were to take an earthworm and cut it into pieces, in theory, each of those pieces could regenerate and grow into a new worm. Now, they also have sexual reproduction. And like we saw with the flatworms, these guys are hermaphrodites, which means, of course, that they have both male and female sex organs. So each worm is going to produce both sperm and eggs. And so what often happens with these guys is they will get up close to one another, like you see here, and they will each give sperm to the other worm, and that other worm will use that sperm to then fertilize its eggs. So this is how it typically works. So we'll talk more about this in detail when we talk about the groups of annelids and the earthworms in particular.